I want to share with you this morning some thoughts on this message. God's SEC, God's Security and Exchange Commission. In both the scriptures that we've heard this morning together, we find Abraham and Sarah, and because of that, their community suffering. We find Paul in jail, suffering, and his community persecuted by the heart of the Roman Empire in the great city of Rome, suffering. It's important to remember that the idea of suffering is not something that you invite. It's not something they invited. They found themselves in a situation where they were suffering. So suffering then is not some kind of saving grace that if you suffer, then you belong to God, or it's proof that you're worthy. Suffering is life circumstance. Chaplain that I had in the community at the University of Massachusetts in the 1960s is a Methodist pastor who was often heard to say, life is good as life is given. And if that's so, then suffering is then a part of life. And life is still accepted as good, even through the suffering. The song, Let Your Faith Be Stronger Than Your Fear, has in the midst of it, I will be the joy that seeks you in your sorrow, through your sorrow, actually. And so Abraham and Sarah, who were suffering not having children, in a society where that's who would help you till the fields, or that's who would help you make the goods that you might sell, that's who would help you through when you're older. They were suffering. And yet, through that suffering, they find themselves transformed. Their laughter at themselves becomes laughter with joy with themselves and with God. For they, even though they were so-called too old to have children, too old to change, find themselves with child, find themselves transformed. And through their suffering, they found new life. Well, of course, Paul and Paul's community are asked to do the same thing in the heart of Paul's scripture. He says, though you're suffering, and everybody knows they are, it is your endurance, your decision to live anyway, to live through that, with all that God has given you, whatever that might be, that in fact ends up building your character. Your suffering brings you to need your endurance, which you use, and find yourself growing and changing, building your character. Now, part of that building, that becoming, is recognizing who you are. For us as Christians, recognizing that we belong to God and that we belong to one another. The Zulu people, most poignantly, historically, are brought out by the life of Nelson Mandela and the work and writings of Bishop Tutu, Archbishop Tutu, says that UBUNTU, that understanding that I am because we are, and we are because I am, that interconnectedness of life, that is the thing we come to recognize as our character begins to show itself and even begins to change and transform. It is that UBUNTU, that understanding of the connectedness to God and to one another, not only expressed in the South African culture, but really the reality of humankind and human being, human living, that we understand through our faith, but it's a universal, God-given. That is the very thing which gives us the hope. You see, so God's security and exchange commission, God's suffering, endurance, and character building leads us to hope. And you see, the thing about hope is that it is all we need. It is all that we have often, but it's the one thing that no one can take away. Now, how does that help us in the present situation, these epidemics that we're facing, the epidemic of the biological virus, COVID-19, and the epidemic of racism, institutionalized over 401 years? Well, let me suggest to you that there is a way forward, a starting point that we have. In order to be enriched by God's Security and Exchange Commission, this UBUNTU, you have to do two things that involve a mask. Now, the first thing that you've got to do, because this biological epidemic is real, is you have to put on a mask. If you really want to live and let live out that relationship of being neighbor, you got to put on a mask. Putting on the mask enables us to communicate with one another, to talk with one another, to buy groceries for and from one another, to do all the things of social life with care. But the other mask that we need to work with is the mask that we wear every day. The masks of race and racism, the masks of rich and poor, the masks of male and female, the masks of heterosexism versus homosexuality. All these pseudo-identities that we wear as masks to actually keep us distant from one another. It is that God's SEC, that hope, that can help us to wear one mask and take off all the others. For isn't that what our faith calls us to do? To be neighbor under God. Amen.